Edwin, you can still hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you guys fine.
Okay, great.
As long
It's
as you're
now
speaking
five
into the
o'clock.
mics.
It's now 5 o'clock on the 2nd of May. We're here to discuss the. I did. Well, I mean, it's not up over here, but the little circle stopped spinning. Did she already leave? It says YouTube. It says live. It's working. Still thinking. It's on, isn't it? It's on. But we're not actually streaming. There we go. Cool. All right. I mean, I'm taking to starting that thing a whole minute early now. All right, welcome. It's the 2nd of May, 5 o'clock. We're here for a special session to go over understanding on star bonds and TIFs for the city of Fort Scott. Gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I am Garth Herman, and with me is Dominic Eck. We're lawyers with Gilmore and Bell. We represent the city as bond counsel. Does it need to be? Okay. How about now? Is that working?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so our plan here is to kind of go over star bonds, to go over tax increment financing, kind of as a educational discussion. So I'm going to talk. I can talk about this stuff for a couple of days. We have an hour though, so I'll do my best to shorten it down into that time. But along the way, if you have any questions or if you need clarification or if you just want to make it into a discussion, please feel free. I've got a lot of kids, so I'm used to being interrupted. I do not take that personally. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. I think we can probably go ahead and talk about star bonds to begin with. It, Both star bonds and TIF are somewhat complex. They're very procedurally intensive. And so what I'm going to do with star bonds is I'll kind of talk big picture. And then I'll come back in and break out kind of each of those steps and provide a little bit more color, a little bit more detail along the way. So star bonds are ultimately, they are a financing tool to help spur economic development within a certain area in a city or a county. The way that they do that is they're able to leverage and use increased sales taxes, both at the state as well as the local level, use those increased sales taxes in order to pay for eligible project costs that occur within that star bond project. The way they do that is there's kind of three steps that you want to think about along the way. So step one is you have an eligible area and you create a district. Step two is you put together a development agreement and you approve a project plan. And then step three is that you ultimately issue the actual bonds, the star bonds, and then you use that money, and that money is available to be used in order to pay for those project costs that were approved in step two. So, kind of big picture, one thing to keep in mind is that every single one of those points, so the eligible area in the district creation, step one, the project plan approval, step two, and the star bond issuance itself in step three. At every one of those three steps, it requires not only city commission action to approve each of those items, it also requires approval of the state of Kansas through the Department of Commerce. So they have to approve what goes on in step one, then in step two, and then in step three. And so when you're thinking about a star bond project, think about it as it's like a three-party agreement where it's going to have the developer, it's going to have the city, and it's going to have the state of Kansas. So it really is a partnership. And since the state of Kansas is going to be providing the bulk of the funds necessary to repay that financing, they have a pretty big seat at the table. And so a lot of times they'll kind of have the final say on whether something is eligible or whether the district is okay or whether the project plan is okay, because ultimately they're the ones putting in the majority of the money, so they're going to have a big say in kind of what the process is and how it turns out. So we go back to step one: eligible area and a star bond district. So in order to create a star bond district, you have to have it in an eligible area. There's a wide variety of different types of things that can qualify as an eligible area, The majority of the ones that we see are areas that are a major commercial, retail, and tourism area, which may include a multi-sport athletic complex. So it doesn't have to include a major multi-sport athletic complex in order for it to be that major commercial, retail, or tourism area, but that is one way that you can get there. So within that eligible area, it has to meet those requirements, and then you have to create an actual district. The process to create the district from the city commission side of it is you have to adopt a resolution that sets the date for a public hearing. That resolution also has to include what is called a Starbond District Plan. That plan includes a map of the district. It includes a legal description of the entire district. It also includes a general description of the projects that are going to occur within that district, whether it's retail or hotels, what the actual Starbond attraction is going to be, like those types of things. It's not fine-grained detail yet at this point, but it's kind of big picture so that everybody has a general idea what's going to go on within this Starbond district. So that's what's really required from the city commission level. So you adopt a resolution, set the date for a public hearing. That public hearing is 30 to 70 days after the date of that resolution. You have to provide mailed and published notice of that upcoming public hearing. So it's going to be mailed to the county, it's going to be mailed to the school board, it's going to be mailed to every owner and occupant of property within the boundaries of that district. And all of that has to occur within certain time periods before the public hearing is held. In addition, information about that upcoming public hearing will have to be posted on the city's website. Usually we recommend you create a separate page within your city website for the Starbond activities and documents that are going to be part of that deal. That way it's kind of a one-stop shop for that. So you do all of that. Then at the public hearing, basically the developer or representative of the developer helps present as to what the district plan is going to be and why they think that it's going to work and kind of what their expectations are. In addition, it is a public hearing, so the public is given the opportunity to come and comment on it. They can't force the city obviously to vote one way or another, but they have to have an opportunity to have their voice heard. Once that's been handled and then the public hearing is closed, then the city commission considers an ordinance to formally establish the district. That ordinance is passed by a simple majority vote of the city commission. Once it's passed, then the district, from the city's perspective, you've done what you need to do. Now, the state of Kansas through the Department of Commerce, though, they're going to be part of that process also, because before you hold your public hearing and before you pass that ordinance, Department of Commerce is going to have to sign off and formally approve in writing the creation of that district and the fact that it's an eligible area. So practically speaking, what this means is that once we have a pretty good idea as to what the boundaries of the district are and what the project is going to be that goes on within that district, we're going to have, Dominic and I, as well as city staff, is going to have conversations with the Department of Commerce. Informal discussions to let them know what the city is anticipating doing with regards to this Starbond district, and to take the temperature of commerce to see if it's something that they're going to approve, or is it something that they might approve with certain changes. Because we want to have those conversations early enough in the process that by the time we call the public hearing, and for sure by the time we hold the public hearing, we want to know that their answer is going to be yes. Because if we don't know if their answer is going to be yes, we don't want to call that public hearing yet, because we don't want to go through the whole process to get to the public hearing and we still don't know if Department of Commerce is going to approve it or not. And so those conversations happen informally, fairly early in the process. They happen throughout that, so that hopefully by the time we get to that public hearing, we already have that letter in hand from the Department of Commerce where they say this is an eligible area and it is a valid star bond district. We know that answer. So the district creation is very important. And this gets back to the main reason why star bonds work the way they do. So if you remember, star bonds work because they are repaid from sales taxes, state sales taxes, city sales taxes, city transient guest taxes, potentially the city's portion of the countywide sales tax, all of that. But it's not repaid from all of the sales tax revenues that happen within the district. It's only repaid from the excess sales tax. We call that the increment. And so the increment is important because when the district is created, that is the date when what's known as the base is set. So when the district is created, we work with Kansas Department of Revenue, and we work with the city to get a list of all the businesses that are within the boundaries of that district. And we get with the Department of Revenue and we say, okay, here are all of the businesses. How much state sales tax did they collect within the previous 12 months? How much city sales tax did they collect? How much transient guest tax did they collect? If the county's involved, or if the city's going to use the county's portion, how much county sales tax was collected from those businesses within the boundaries of that district. Whatever those numbers are, that becomes the base. Yes.
Quick question. So that is an average of the sales taxes taking place over that 12-month period?
It's the actual.
The actual.
So let's say our star bond district, let's say it gets created August 15th, 2023. So we work with the Department of Revenue and we say, okay, Department of Revenue, from August 2022 through July of 2023, what was the actual amount in total during that 12-month period of the state sales tax collected, and the city sales tax collected, and the city transient guest tax collected? And so they tell us, and let's say all of those numbers added together, let's just say it's $5 million. So that becomes your base. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but this becomes important because then once those star bonds are issued, there is no revenue to repay those star bonds until you are in excess of that base. And so your star bonds are issued and development occurs within the district. And so all of that revenue goes in. So let's say you get up to $4 million worth of revenue. Well, you still don't have any money to pay your star bonds. You get to $5 million of revenue. You've reached your base, which means you still have no money to pay your star bonds. You get to $6 million of revenue. Okay, now you've got $1 million of revenue available to go towards the star bonds, because up until that point, up until that $5 million, that $5 million still goes to everybody just like normal. So that's kind of the hold harmless. So out of that $5 million, whatever's the state gets that, the city gets theirs, the county gets theirs, the transient guest tax, it gets used for its normal purposes. But then once you get $1 above that base, then you have $1 available to pay your star bonds. So that's kind of how it works. So when the star bonds are issued, there might not be any money to pay the principal and interest on the star bonds until October. You know, it might take that long.
So if it starts on August 15th, is that when, let's say 5 million never used, is it August 15th? Is it the date you put it into exception, or is there a different?
That's just the date for determining the base.
I mean, so every year, how do they figure if that base is hit?
From January 1st.
Okay.
So basically January 1st every year it resets. So if it takes from January 1st, 2024, and you start at zero, and let's say it takes until October 1st of 2024 to get to your 5 million, but that's fine. At least you met your base. But that means that up until that date, you haven't had any money available to pay the interest and the principal on the star bond. So basically every calendar year it resets. So that's something that's taken into account in step 3 when the bond deal is being put together. The repayment dates and how that bond is repaid, that's something that is looked at by the city and the Department of Commerce and the investment bank who's buying those bonds to make sure that the dates are going to line up to the best estimates with what that revenue stream is going to look like coming in.
And,
So
and let's say the base is never hit, worst case scenario, base hit, who eats all that?
that's the risk of,
State?
well, that's the risk of the bond owner.
Okay.
So if I'm the investment bank and I buy that star bond, but the revenue never reaches the base, that means that there's no money to repay the star bond. Now, all of that money in the base, like I said, that still goes to the state and to the city and to the county and all that. So that's the hold harmless. But I'm not held harmless.
So our star bonds harder to sell than
They are.
revenue?
They are. And that's why, normally when the city does a bond issue, okay, we've got this project, we need to go out and we're going to have a public sale for bonds, and there's going to be 3 or 4 or 5 investment banks are going to put bids in on it. They're general obligation bonds, are going to get repaid. Those are an entirely different animal than a star bond. Star bonds take a specific type of bank who knows how they work. They know what they're getting into. They're also going to do a lot of analysis. And so I'll get back to this point in a second, but part of that analysis is going to be how big of a star bond are they willing to buy? And so at the front end, step one, the developer might say, we can do a $50 million star bond. And then by the time you get to step 2 and 3, Department of Commerce might say, we're not comfortable with that. We think we could sign off on a $35 million star bond. Then you get to step 3, and that investment bank is going to buy the bonds. They're going to do their own analysis, and they're going to look at what is the projected revenue, how much development is going to occur, what do we, the bank, think is going to be the incremental revenue available to pay this. Then they might back into a number, and they say, we're comfortable buying $20 million of star bonds. And so developer might think it's a big number, state might think it's somewhere in the middle, but ultimately if the investment bank, they do their own analysis and they say, here's what our number is, that's what the number is. So that's kind of how that works, but it is a much riskier investment, which is why it's sold in a different way, and it takes a lot more input and a lot more work from the bank side to determine, what risk are they willing to accept. Yeah.
But these are banks that predominantly deal in purchasing these kind of star bonds. Those would be the ones that would be interested. So they've probably done projects like this before.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And we've worked and our firm has worked on a number of star bonds in the state of Kansas. There's a handful of banks who buy them. There's probably, for sure 2, maybe 3 banks over the years who have actively, purchased these bonds. They know what they're getting into, and they do a good job. They do a good job, but it's not going to be your run-of-the-mill, bank who's going to come out and buy these types of bonds.
Yes, sir.
Yep. So that's step 1. Yes. Yes.
So, can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
But sometimes a developer can go out and have those conversations prior to the project, right? Say, hey, asking how much do you think bond-wise?
Yeah, they can, part of the issue is kind of the chicken and the egg though, is it's really hard to get a good estimate on the size of the bond issue until you have a really good estimate on all of the development that's going to occur, because that is ultimately, star bonds, they don't get sold and repaid based on existing retail. It's all about what is new, how is this going to grow, how is this going to increase? Because, frankly speaking, the buyer of that bond, they don't necessarily care what's there now, because they're not going to get repaid from that. So it's really until they have that kind of step 2, the project plan, and really the details about that, that's really when they're able to start putting together that feasibility study to help determine realistically what's the size of that bond going to be.
But there's a good chance that those banks that probably worked, if it's a developer who's done star bonds before, there's a good chance they probably worked with that person or their organization before, and that person would help facilitate that back and forth between the banks and the developer, correct?
Yeah, it will help. It will help, yeah. And so that's step 1. Eligible area, create the district, requires State Department of Commerce approval, as well as city commission action, resolution to call the public hearing, provide all the notices, hold the public hearing, and adopt the ordinance. So that's step one. Step two is the development agreement and the project plan. So development agreement first, it is not required under statute. It is a practical necessity though. So the development agreement is a contract between the city and the developer. It sets out basically all of the duties and obligations of both parties. So it provides what the city is going to agree to do. It provides what the developer is going to be obligated to do. It provides clarity on the specific project costs that are anticipated to be eligible to be repaid from the STAR bonds. Not everything can be repaid from STAR bonds. So the development agreement provides clarity so that everybody knows going into the deal, is it in this bucket that's going to get paid, or is it in that bucket that's not going to be paid? A lot of times it'll have specific milestones and project pieces in there. So if the developer says we're going to build a hotel, 2 restaurants, and the STAR bond attraction, that is great. We're going to have detail about what type of restaurants, how big, what type of hotel, is there going to be a specific flag on it, how many rooms, the STAR bond attraction itself, what is it going to be, how big is it, what is it anticipated to represent and to encompass. There's going to be construction milestones out there so that construction of the hotel will occur, X number of days or months after the STAR bond issue, and construction is anticipated to finish within 18 months or 24 months after it starts. Same thing for the restaurants, same thing for the STAR bond attraction itself, so that there are kind of known milestones built into this. And then once again, the whole theory of the development agreement is before the bonds are even issued, everybody has an understanding as to what's the deal. How quickly is it going to happen? What is the money going to be used for? How is it going to be repaid? Those types of things are built into that development agreement. Like I said, it's not required under state law. Practically speaking, though, you're going to need to have that just so that 3 years down the road, when a question comes up, we're not scrambling around looking for our notes. We've got this, 40-page document that everybody signed off on. So that's a requirement for the development agreement. We normally have that put together at the same time as step 2 with that project plan. So the project plan is really the heavy lifting part of this, because the project plan takes that district plan, where the district plan, remember, was kind of generally, here's what we plan on doing. The project plan is specifically, here's what we're going to do, and here are these specific areas where we're going to do it at. Part of that project plan also requires what's known as a feasibility study. So this is a feasibility study. It's put together by a third party. There's an approved list of vendors that the Department of Commerce has as to who can prepare the feasibility study. In essence, it has to show like 17 different things. The main ones are, it has estimates as to future visitation requirements, because ultimately that's one of the big reasons for the STAR bond is to attract people from outside of the region into the region, bring them to Fort Scott. So part of the STAR bond law says, well, okay, that's nice. You have to have some sort of visitation estimates to make sure that it's meeting certain types of requirements. So it'll have that in there. It'll also need to have verification on the estimated amount of money that's going to go into the overall project. So when we talk about the project, it's not just the STAR bond attraction. The project is everything. So it's the hotels, the restaurants, the retail, the attraction itself, the infrastructure that's going to serve it. It's basically everything that is going to be developed and built within the boundaries of this project area. That's kind of the capital P project. So it's going to have information about that. It'll need to have at least a certain amount of capital investment for that project, for rural development projects. I think the threshold is $3 million. So that is generally going to be something, if you're building any sort of building nowadays that's brand new, it's going to be pretty hard to do that for less than $3 million anyway. But there are certain thresholds that'll have to be met. So that'll be part of the feasibility study. In order to put that together, they're also going to need that information that we talked about, like from the development agreement, because that feasibility study is going to show the estimated revenues that this district is going to kick off. And the only way they're going to be able to figure out those estimated revenues is that they're going to need to know, okay, what are you going to build in there that's going to provide sales tax revenue? How quickly is it going to come online? How much in sales do you think it's going to actually do once it's up and running? And they're going to take all that information to put together a analysis that shows, okay, here's what we think over the 20-year life of this project, here's what we think those incremental revenues are going to be, the amount of revenues over that base. But a lot of that depends on what are you going to build and how quickly you're going to build it. So that's what goes into that feasibility study. Like I said, there's a lot of different things that are required to go in there. Those are some of the main ones. Like I said, that's prepared by an independent third party. It can be hired by the developer. It can be hired by the city. You can split the cost, but it's a requirement for that project plan.
Are there any limitations in state, out of state?
Nope. So once, so that feasibility is part of that project plan. So once that project plan is ready to go, it's a very similar process to step one. City Commission is going to have to adopt a resolution, call in a public hearing, and including, a map and a legal description and a general description of the project plan. You'll have to mail notice, you'll have to publish notice, and you'll have to post notice on your website. Same timing requirements as the district, so you adopt the resolution, 30 to 70 days later, you hold the public hearing. After the public hearing, you adopt an ordinance. Now here's a couple things where it gets a little different. So before you adopt your ordinance, before you actually hold your public hearing, you're also going to have the City Planning Commission approve the development of the project plan and that it basically is in line with the requirements of the city. So the Planning Commission has to approve it before you actually hold the public hearing. The other kind of main difference in the timing is the ordinance approving the project plan is not a simple majority. It's a 2/3 majority vote. So it's a higher threshold to approve the ordinance for the project plan than it is for the district. So those are kind of the two main procedural differences regarding that piece of it. Department of Commerce still has to have written approval before you approve that project plan. So once again, just like we did with the district, once we get through the district process and we start getting that specific information, Dominic and I and Brad and Bob and other folks are going to have conversations with the Department of Commerce to figure out, here is what the developer is going to request, and here are estimated amounts for those. And the Department of Commerce is going to go through, it's going to be like a line item budget. And they're going to go through and they'll look at it and they'll say, we are okay with this one, generally in these amounts. We're okay with this one. We're not going to pay for that. We're not going to pay for that. Depending on where this is located at, we might pay for a little bit of this. I mean, they're going to go through and they will give you specifics as to yes, no, or maybe. And so that's all part of that sifting process. And so that's why we want to have those conversations early. So then we bring that back to the city folks, and we bring that back to the developer, and we say, here's what we have from our conversations. And we start coming up with a more firm number for what the Department of Commerce is going to be okay with. So once again, going back to my earlier example, the developer says 50 million. This is the part where the Department of Commerce wills it down and they say 35. Because there's just going to be some things they're going to say no, they're not going to do it. But that's all part of the conversation, so that by the time you hold that public hearing and you have that ordinance to approve the project plan, you've got your letter in hand from Commerce that they say, we approve this as a project, and we approve these amounts. So that's step 2. Step 3, star bond issuance itself. So this is when the investment bank comes in and they start looking at the numbers, and they may do their own feasibility analysis. They may look at the one that was statutorily required to be prepared, and they might say, that's nice, we're going to do our own. And so that'll be part of their process. And that's what they're going to use to figure out, you know, in my example of the 35 million, they might look at this and they say, over a 20-year period, we don't think that there's enough revenue to support 35 million. Or they might say, there might be, if everything goes great, but we're bankers. We deal in risk, and we like to minimize risk. So that's the point where they're going to start using their own analysis to come up with a number that they're comfortable with, that the developer's comfortable with, and that the Department of Commerce and the city are going to sign off on. So the star bond process, this is where there's not as much heavy lifting from the city side. There's a lot of heavy lifting still from Dominic's and I side, though, because this is where we're putting together all of the actual bond documents. And this is the part, I won't get too far down in the weeds here, but basically there will be a official statement that's prepared that basically describes the city, describes the bonds, describes the project, describes the estimated repayment stream. There's probably going to be 2 or 3 different analyses in there. Best case scenario, medium case scenario, worst case scenario, and a lot of it just depends on what those incremental revenues are going to look like. The investment bank, they're going to take that information, they're going to go out, they're going to sell it to their customers, and they're going to come back with the final interest rates. State of Commerce has to approve that final bond structure and those final interest rates before the bonds can actually be sold. And so once again, they're going to sign a letter. They're going to say, we agree with the bond structure, we agree with these, we approve the issuance of bonds, and we approve the use of the bond proceeds to pay for these specific items in these amounts. So once again, they're putting their weight into it, and they're saying, here is what we are okay with the bonds paying for. Down the road, projects or pieces of this project that have not been approved, you can't use the bond proceeds for those. Maybe you can come back and ask again, but until that point, you can't use it.
So they get as specific as, for this attraction or for this feature that's out here, here's the amount.
They get specific as.
So if there's a cost overrun on that particular item, where does the difference as far as payment for that fall back to?
Yeah. So there's always going to be more project costs than there are star bonds.
Sure.
So it's going to usually have to come either from the developer, who's going to have some money in it, or depending on which type of which piece of the project it is, it may be the city. But once again, it's only going to be the city if the city's agreed to that up front. So with regards to the bond itself, a couple things to keep in mind. Star bonds legally can't pay for more than 50% of the capital P project costs. So remember, that's everything. That's hotels, retail, land acquisition, the star bond attraction, infrastructure, all of that sort of stuff. Legally, they can't pay for more than 50%. Practically speaking, they're going to pay for 20 to 30% of that, because Department of Commerce is reluctant to approve up to 50%. I don't know that I've seen them do 50% before. Generally speaking, it's in the 20 to 30% range. So what's not paid for the star bonds, a lot of that's going to come from developer equity. Another thing that is required for the star bonds, practically and legally speaking, is the city's going to have some sort of skin in the game. And so that can take different forms. That can take the form of the city pledges its city sales tax and city transient guest tax that are collected within the boundaries of the district to the repayment of the bonds. That's one way to have skin in the game. Another way to have skin in the game is the city might say, okay, there's, out of this overall project, there's $2 million worth of infrastructure. Maybe it's roads and it needs some water lines out there and that sort of thing. The city might say, okay, we'll finance that and we'll put in that piece of it. So that's another way to have skin in the game.
Can the city actually do those? Could they do the water,
As long as it's public.
as
As
long as it's public?
long as it's a public improvement,
Okay.
then it's just like a public improvement anywhere else.
Okay.
If the city needs to run water lines out to it, you can do that. Sewer lines out to it, you can do that. If there are road improvements that need to be made, the city can do that. Public improvements, yes. This is all part of the conversation with the Department of Commerce also, because the city might say, we'll pledge our sales tax revenues within the district. And the Department of Commerce might say, okay, how much is that? And it might not be very much. And so the state might say, well, that's nice. That's not much skin. You're going to have to do something else above and beyond that. So that's kind of all part of the discussion. But if once the bonds are issued and we're down that path and we already know what the STAR bonds are going to pay for, and by that point, we already know what the city has agreed to pay for, whether it's putting its sales tax money into it, or if the city says we're going to do some of this infrastructure, that's all going to be part of that development agreement. Once again, that's going to line out what everybody's responsibilities are. Bonds are issued, we're actually breaking ground and we're constructing stuff. We get into cost overruns. Then if it's something that's not eligible to be paid for STAR bonds, or it's not eligible to be paid by the city, then that's up to the developer. It's like any other development project. They're going to have to come up with the funds to do that, or they're going to have to do change orders in order to change the scope of that so that it fits within what the budget is.
Okay, but again, going back to the process of developing the agreement between the city and developer, that's when you would hopefully hash out those details.
Yes, exactly.
Covers what and how.
Exactly. And a lot of times in those budgets, there's going to be contingencies, that are built into it. So there might be a line item for contingency, or within each kind of general category, there might be a contingency part that's built into that, just because most of us who've ever worked on a project, it's, I guess, maybe it's just me, it's rare for it to come in on budget or under budget as much as you want it to. So a lot of times there will be those contingencies that are kind of built in to help alleviate, some of those issues down the road. Yep. Yes.
Can the donation of land, that can go towards the skin, right?
It can. I mean, that'll be part of the conversation with
What
Commerce.
about donation of land from someone other than the city?
It'll have to be part of the conversation with the department. Yeah. As to whether they would count that or not. Yeah. Yeah. And so the last kind of part of the bond piece that I want to talk about also is the actual repayment. So as part of the bond documents in step 3, the city will enter into an agreement with the Department of Revenue where it's a tax distribution agreement, because there's going to be multiple sources of funds that are going to go to repay those bonds. So under the tax distribution agreement, it's between the city, the Department of Revenue, and then the bond trustee, who is a trust bank, who actually is going to handle the money that's coming in and used to repay the bonds. And so how that's going to work is, the city sales taxes. So obviously, city doesn't collect those monies. Those are collected and sent up to Department of Revenue. Department of Revenue will send the incremental city sales tax to the bond trustee to hold on to those. So once again, as you reach your base, you get your sales tax money. Once you exceed your base, then that money goes to the bond trustee to be held. The state sales tax, once it gets to the base and then exceeds the base, so the incremental state sales tax, the state doesn't like to give that money up. So they're going to hold on to that, but they put it in a special fund. And then a couple days before the bond payment's due, the Department of Revenue transfers that money to the bond trustee so that when it's time to make that bond payment, whatever funds are available are then with the bond trustee and they can be used to repay those bonds. So how the bonds get structured and repaid, once again, your normal bond issue, you do a 20-year bond issue, you have a specific amount of principal that's coming due every year for 20 years. So on day one, you know exactly in year 19 what your payment is going to be. That's how a normal bond issue works. Once again, these are different animals. That's not how star bonds work. Star bonds work, they can go up to 20 years. So whatever the amount of the star bonds is, let's say it's $20 million. So you've got $20 million due in 20 years. As that money goes to the increment, and then the increment goes to the bond trustee twice a year. So once every 6 months, the bond trustee is going to say, okay, we have a payment date coming up. How much money do I have in the bank? That's how many bonds we're going to pay off. And so the term for this is called like a super sinker, because there's a set repayment dates, but there are not set repayment amounts. It's just whatever revenue is available, that amount goes to pay interest. And then once the interest amount has been paid, whatever's left over, use it to knock off the principal. And so that's how these are usually structured. It's a way to help prevent a payment default. Because once again, going back to the timing question, if you don't have actually any incremental revenue available to pay something until later in the year, but if you had a payment earlier in the year, you don't want to have a payment default right out the gate, just because of a difference in timing. And so once again, that's why these bonds are sold to specific types of banks that know what they're getting into. And that's part of the reason why they're structured that way. So that's kind of how the bonds work with regards to the star bond side of it.
Two quick questions there. One, best case scenario, we have tons of money, we pay off the bond early.
Yes.
And all the rest of the money comes to us. It doesn't keep going to the state.
Once the bonds pay off and the district is terminated, then the sales tax money flows as it normally would.
Okay.
Yes.
Two, worst case scenario, into the bond comes up and we still haven't met the bond obligations. What happens then?
Then the owner of those bonds doesn't get paid.
Okay.
And so usually that's why the investment bank is going to do their own analysis, because they do not want to be in that situation. And so the way that the investment banks kind of work around that is they're going to say, well, okay, we're going to have a higher interest rate on it because it's a little bit riskier, or we're going to allow a smaller amount of bonds, because they want the bonds to be a big enough amount that it can do the project, but a small enough amount that there is not going to be a risk that it doesn't get paid.
Well, I think that's where the importance of the experience of the developer and all the feasibility studies that are done. I mean, some of this that I've looked into has literally said, that if you're municipal, to try and help assure some type of guarantee that it's not going to fail, is that it will generate enough new taxable revenue to fully fund the municipal's debt service payments. And then the developer themselves, I'm sure would be looked at in any case to ensure that they're adequately secured as well.
Yeah, so sometimes, under the Star Bond Act, the city, if there are insufficient monies to make the bond payment, the city can't just go to your bond and interest fund and use public funds. So the Star Bonds, they can only get repaid from the specific sources of revenue that were agreed to up front. So they're not a general obligation to the city. They're a special obligation. So if there's not enough money to make the payment, that does not mean the city has to step up and fill the gap.
How does that differ than what I just asked between a star bond and something like a TIF?
So a TIF can be similar to the Star Bond.
Yeah.
It's from property taxes increment instead of sales tax increment. But unless it is a general obligation, the city can't just come up and fill the gap. In essence, if there are insufficient funds, that's the risk that the buyer of those bonds is taking. And that's why when they're doing their analysis, they might downsize that bond issue
Okay.
to help avoid that risk as much as possible.
The other piece there is the TIF Act specifically allows for a procedure for the city to put their general obligation backing behind a TIF bond. That's different than the Star Bond Act, which does not have the same provisions.
Yep.
So you can have general obligation TIF bonds where the credit of the city is the backstop for that. That's not the same statutory construct for the Star Bond process.
Okay.
So there is a difference there between what is and is not allowed from a statutory perspective.
Okay.
A couple other things to keep in mind with regards to the Star Bonds and the project and the district. So that first step, creating the district, it's really important to determine the legal description and the boundaries of that district, because once those are set, there's a method to change them, but the method to change them is you start back at square one and you go through the process again. So when you're setting those boundaries, you want to make sure that the boundaries are big enough that they include everywhere you want to spend Star Bond money. Star Bond money can only pay for costs within the boundaries of the Star Bond district. So if this is my line and this table is the district, and I want to pay for a lift station that's over here, then I need to draw the boundaries of that district to include that lift station. Because if it's not in there, you can't spend Star Bond money on it. So you want the boundaries big enough to include everywhere you're going to spend money, but you want them small enough that they don't capture or cap a lot of the sales tax revenue of the city that you may need sometime in the next 20 years. Because once that district is set, remember, that's when that base amount is set. And so you still get the base amount, you still get your piece of that base amount, but any of the increases that come from whether it's the development related to the Star Bond project or just growth in the city in general. And if you need any of those increased revenues to help handle that growth in the future, whether it's public services or whatever it is, if that amount is capped because of the boundaries of the Star Bond district, then your ability to access that increased value is also capped, because every dollar above that base doesn't go to you. It goes to the Star Bond.
Until it's paid off.
Until it's paid off. Yeah. So we always talk about want the district big enough to pay for everything within it, but small enough that it doesn't artificially cap your ability to pay for future costs down the road.
Okay.
The other thing to keep in mind with the district, and I know, Brad and Bob and I have talked about this, is cities can do a Star Bond district inside the boundaries of the city. You can also do a Star Bond district that overlaps inside and outside the city. So it's doable. In order to do that, though, you have to have county consent. And the method for the county to consent is the exact same steps as the city takes for step one, creating your district. So if your district is inside and outside of city limits, then when the city adopts a resolution to call a public hearing to create the district, County Commission adopts a resolution to call a public hearing to create the district. City holds its public hearing to create the district. County Commission holds its public hearing to create the district. City passes its ordinance to formally create the district. County Commission adopts a resolution to consent to the creation of it. So you can do it. It'll just take some coordination with the folks over at the county, if that's the path that we take on that.
Is it easier just to go ahead and annex that area into the city with the consent of the county?
It's a timing question, because if you're going to annex it, then the annexation process needs to be completed before you adopt that resolution to call your public hearing, because once again, in that resolution calling your public hearing, you're drawing your boundaries and your legal description in that resolution. And so when you do that resolution, if you're inside and outside of the city at that time, then you'd have to do the county.
Okay.
But so that's why if you're going to annex it, that's, I'm not an annexation expert. Bob's so much more knowledgeable on that than I am. But whatever that process is, we would want to make sure that it is complete. And then we start our district resolution, public hearing, that step one process. We want to do step one after the annexation is complete, if that's the path that we take.
Because I'm assuming without annexation, your sales tax, you're not going to capture city sales tax, right?
Correct. Because it's only the sales taxes imposed in that district. So if this is my city and this is my county and this is my district, over here, there's state sales taxes, city sales taxes, and city's portion of the county sales tax. Over here, there's no city sales tax. There's only state. Now, the county can agree to use the county's portion of its sales tax if it wants to, but it's not required to. So if it's outside of city limits, for sure there's state sales tax. Everything else is a little bit iffy.
So the county can use their sales tax anywhere, the county, city. I mean, they can opt to use their sales tax towards a star bond also.
If they agree to it. If they agree to it. That's star bonds. 51 minutes. Yeah, yep. So are there any other questions about star bonds?
No, I don't think I did.
Yeah. I bet we can cram TIF into
We
about
can
8
get
minutes.
to absolutely.
Let everybody finish a minute early. All right. So TIF is a lot like star bonds. It used to be part of the same statute, and then they got split out.
Okay.
TIF is like star bonds, except it's with property tax instead of sales tax. TIF does not involve the state of Kansas. It's only property tax driven, and it's incremental property tax driven, but it's think of it as the same 3 steps. You have district creation, project plan approval, bonds. District creation for TIF has to be in a eligible area. There's a variety. You can't just go out and create a TIF anywhere. It's got to be either in a blighted area, a conservation area, or you can use a major commercial, tourism, and retail area. So similar concept, eligible area, and then you have to have your district approval. So same type of a process. You have city commission adopt a resolution, call a public hearing, 30 to 70 days later, you're mailing notices, you're publishing notices, you have a public hearing, your resolution describes the boundaries of the district, it has the map of the district, it has a description of the project plan. You hold the public hearing, after the public hearing, pass the ordinance to create the TIF district. Once again, that's the point that the line in the sand is drawn and your base is set, except it's your base on the assessed value within the boundaries of that district. So whatever that base amount is, whatever that assessed valuation is, let's say it's $5 million. So going forward, all of the property taxes that are collected on the property in the TIF district on that $5 million base value, those property taxes still go to the same people. So the county gets their piece, city gets their piece, school district gets their piece, all of that. As that property develops, the value goes up. The property tax revenue that's collected on that increased value above the base, that's the tax increment revenue that gets diverted into a TIF fund, and then that's what can be used to pay for the project cost. So same sort of a concept. Your base value is what everybody's held harmless. As it's developed, that value increases. The property tax revenue from that increased value, that goes to the TIF. It's a property tax driven, which in essence means that the property tax increment is getting diverted from everybody else who would rely on that. Because of that, hold your public hearing, pass your ordinance. There's a 30-day veto period. During that 30 days, the county commission can adopt a resolution that says this TIF is going to have an adverse effect on us. We want to kill it. Or school district, Board of Education, during that 30-day period can adopt a resolution saying this TIF is going to have an adverse effect on it, and then they kill it. They have that right. Once that 30 days has passed, the TIF district has been created, notice is given to the county, they get it on their books. Step 2, your project plan approval, very similar. What is the development going to be in here? You're going to put together that development agreement. If you're doing a TIF and a STAR at the same time, you're going to have one development agreement that that applies to both the TIF and the STAR, just kind of how you want to handle it, but you want that development agreement for the same reasons under STAR. So under TIF, you have your project plan. What is the development going to be? How is this going to increase the value? How is this going to increase that revenue that's available to pay for the project costs? Once that's ready to go, the city adopts a resolution, calls a public hearing. 30, 70 days later, public hearing, pass an ordinance, once again, 2/3 vote to approve the TIF project plan. Once that's in place, next step is the bonds. As Dominic mentioned, two different types of bonds, either special obligation, they're only paid from the TIF revenues. If TIF revenues are insufficient, that's the deal. Or they can have a general obligation backing, which means they're payable from the TIF revenues. If the TIF revenues are insufficient, the city is required to backstop them. That's the difference right there. So the GEO-backed TIF bonds are going to be more secure, probably easier to sell, but it's the city's credit on the line versus the special obligation bonds. That's going to be part of the analysis when we're looking to do the financing as to which way is more important. Similar deal, you put together the bond information, you sell the bonds, the investment bank's going to buy them. And then once that money is in the bank, it's going to be used in accordance with the approved project plan and that development agreement. One thing to keep in mind, important about TIF, it can't pay for everything. It normally is used to pay for horizontal infrastructure, street, sewer, water. It can pay for some land acquisition. It can pay for some like parking structures if they're publicly owned. But generally speaking, that's really what it's going to be used to pay for. It's not going to pay for a lot of the vertical construction. It's not going to pay for a lot of the buildings. Think of it more as a horizontal infrastructure that's going to be out there. So it lasts for 20 years also. Similar deal. If you issue bonds and it goes great guns, and those TIF bonds have enough revenue that they repay early, then you can terminate the TIF district. It goes away, and then everybody shares in the development and the increased value that was created due to that TIF, just like the STAR bonds.
Does every taxing entity have to be on board, or is it all or none, or if one vetoes it, they can move forward with two or three?
No, just only the county and only the school district have a veto right. There is a method in TIF where you can enter into an agreement with them to basically change the amount of revenue that gets diverted away from them and into the TIF fund. So there is a way that you can kind of do it, but it's, if you're going to, it's difficult to treat different entities differently. So if you're going to do it for one, you have to assume everybody's going to have the opportunity to take advantage of that.
Rock on. What's our next step?
Yeah, hey, not bad. Not bad. So those are kind of big pictures. So I mean, I think the takeaway is, you know, Dominic and I have been working with the city, you know, one form or another on these projects for a while. They aren't fast projects, but that's just how they are. They are procedurally intensive. There's a lot of steps. There's a lot of information that goes into them. It's important to get all of that correct up front, and it makes everything smoother down the road, because we don't want to get to a point where we have to back up and start over because, oh, we need the district to be a different size, or we didn't have this, or we didn't have that. So I think sometimes it seems like it's taking forever. And it is a long process, but a lot of it is making sure that all the pieces are set and everything is in the right place. So when it's ready to go, then we can move forward, and we have good discussions with the state. We have good discussions with the city. We have good discussions with the developer to make sure that ultimately it's the project that the community wants. So I know that's a lot of information. If you guys have questions, or if you need to discuss this any further, please feel free to go hold of Dominic. Feel free to get a hold of myself. Like I said, I could talk about this for days, so I do not mind. But no, that's the beauty of us. We don't always do it that way. But definitely thank you all for your time. And like I said, if you have any other questions, please feel free to follow up.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Dominic?